Welcome to Positive Disintegration, a path to authenticity. Before we begin, I would like to issue you with a content warning. The following episode may be distressing for some people as we discuss the topic of suicide. Due to the nature of what we discuss, we will split this topic over two slightly smaller episodes because, to be quite honest, while it is a very important topic to address, it is a lot to take in. So this is part one of our two-part conversation with our guest, Stacey Freedenthal. Hello, wonderful listeners, and welcome to Positive Disintegration. I'm Emma Nicholson.
I'm Chris Wells.
And Chris, today we're tackling a very tough topic, but I think one that's very important for us to address on this podcast.
Yes, this is such an important topic, and I can't believe that we're only now having an episode about it.
So our guest today is Stacey Freedenthal. Stacey is an educator, psychotherapist, suicidologist, consultant, and writer. An associate professor at the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work, her research and scholarship focuses on suicide-related topics. Stacey teaches graduate courses on suicide assessment and intervention, clinical social work theory and practice, and other topics related to mental health. Her website, Speaking of Suicide, is a website full of resources for suicidal individuals, loved ones, survivors, and others who care. Welcome to the podcast, Stacey.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that introduction.
I'm so happy that you're joining us, Stacey. So let me introduce how we know each other. You were my professor when I was at the University of Denver at the Graduate School of Social Work getting my master's degree. And I meant to look it up, but I must have taken your course in 2007 or 2008 because I graduated in 2008, which is kind of mind-blowing to me that it's been that long. But I had you for assessment of mental health in adults. And I don't think I could have imagined at the time that we would be having this conversation on a podcast. But I'm so glad that we are. I've had the honor of talking with your classes a few times at DU over the past few years. And I'm just so happy that you're joining us to talk about suicide, which is just a hugely important issue. And one that was so close to Dąbrowski's heart, the man whose theory we talk about on this podcast. So thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome. And I have to say for everyone listening that my students love when Chris comes and talks to one of my classes. It's like the high point of the quarter. So thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
It's great that we both are happy with you doing it.
It is. I didn't realize when you were my professor that you had such a powerful experience on your own journey that led you to do this work around suicide. So I wonder if you could share for our listeners how you came to do this work.
Well, before I do, I'll just say that nobody knew that when you were taking a class from me, if you took a class in 2007 or 2008, because I really hid the fact that I myself have been suicidal. I was scared of the stigma and of judgment and of it hurting me and, hurting me professionally for people to know. So you weren't the only one in the dark.
Well, I just wonder about your story, your own journey of grappling with suicidal thoughts and an attempt, perhaps. I don't know your story. I have shared a bit of my story in an early episode, and I want to welcome you to talk about it in this episode if you don't mind.
That's fine with me, because while I kept it secret for a long time, I feel like now I make up for lost time. And I'm kidding, but actually I do feel like there's a reward to talking about it, in that it may free other people up to talk about their own experience. And I know I've met people have come up to me and told me, that hearing me and my story has helped them to feel better about being a mental health professional with their own lived experience of suicidality, or being a student studying to become a mental health professional, or somebody, they may be considering telling people. So that's one reason why I do share my story. And also because I'm not embarrassed by it. I'm not ashamed by it. I don't buy into the stigma, although I do recognize that there's stigma out there. So I guess I'll start with when I was young. When I was about 12 is when I first started having suicidal thoughts. And I was an adolescent girl. And I don't know about your schools, but at my school, adolescent girls were very vicious. And some days I would go to school and not know if people were going to talk to me or not. And I'd walk in and no one would talk to me and no one would tell me why. And they'd just ignore me. And that was really hard for me. I was very sensitive. I'm still quite sensitive. And I just felt really, I would say bullied at times, but I also have to say sometimes I was in the in group and did some of the bullying, like it was a cliquey thing. And so if I was in the in group and they were shunning someone else, I was grateful to be in the in group. That summer between my 7th and 8th grades, when I was 12 turning 13, I had an experience at a summer camp where I was just ignored so much in this bullying game that girls were playing. And something happened at the camp and I just felt desperate. And that was the first time I really seriously thought like of killing myself and how I would do it and why I would do it. But I got through it. And in junior high and in high school, I would still have suicidal thoughts sometimes, but it was more like kind of a fascination with suicide, or even like, this is going to sound really weird, but sometimes like envy of people who did act on their suicidal thoughts. And then my sophomore year of high school, we had 2 suicides in our school, and they were both sophomores. And one was somebody I knew, but not well, like I would recognize him and we would say hi to each other, but we were in completely different circles. My high school had 2,000 people, but the other one was somebody I was friends with. And my circle of friends had been with him the night that he killed himself. We were at a party and he probably ended his life probably an hour or 2 after the party. That was hard, and that, like, there's like these different paths I've been on. There's the personal path, but that also kind of started my professional path in a way. It wouldn't happen for quite a few years, but that was when I first started having the questions that I later studied in my doctoral program, which was about why don't people get help when they have suicidal thoughts and why don't they tell others? Then in college, I started having suicidal thoughts again, more severely. And really every year I'd have some kind of depressive episode and they would be more intense. And I did have some suicide attempts in my 20s. And I mentioned that I hid my past for a very long time, except for people who were, very, very close to me. And even then, they didn't know all the details. In college, I had an experience that I then wrote about in 2017, and that's when I kind of came out of the closet. And I wrote about this, and it was published in the New York Times. So I didn't come out of the closet in a small way. It was a little overwhelming. But what happened that I wrote about was that when I was in my first year of my MSW program, I had a suicide attempt where, and I won't go into the details of the method, but it involved not being able to breathe anymore. And as I couldn't breathe, my body was like trying, and I was struck by like, here, I don't want to breathe. I don't want to breathe, but my body wants to breathe. And then it just got so hard to breathe. And I just kind of had this, it sounds trite, like it sounds overly simplistic, but I just had this realization that like, oh my God, I don't want to die. I want to stop hurting, and I don't have to die. And so what they call on suicidology, or some people call, others don't like the term, but I aborted my attempt. And ever since then, I've never acted on suicidal thoughts again. I continued in my MSW program. You can see, though, why I kept that secret, because I was just in my first year of an MSW program. And then I got a job at the counseling center about maybe 5 months after that. And it was at at a 24-hour hotline that the University of Texas used to run from their counseling center. And people there would say really mean things about callers who had suicidal thoughts. I don't know if you've ever been around this kind of, I guess it's like a form of gallows humor, where people, I guess it's like a way to cope with the enormity of what they're hearing. But that just made my resolve even stronger to not tell anybody about my own experiences. And then I worked clinically for a few years, always in a crisis setting. So I was always dealing with people who had suicidal thoughts. And then I decided to go back and get a PhD to look at, to do research mostly on mental health service use and lack thereof among people who had suicidal thoughts. And fast forward 19 years from when I got my PhD, I can't believe it. And here we are. Oh, and I should say also, I started a therapy practice a little over 10 years ago, specializing in helping people who have suicidal thoughts or have loved ones who have suicidal thoughts, or tragically have a loved one who died by suicide.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing all that with us. The first thing that's coming to mind for me is that I'm wondering what you found in your dissertation work. What has your research shown?
So my dissertation, I used a secondary data set from a national study, and I can't believe I remember this number all these years later, but it had 19,430 adolescents, and a sobering finding for me. I mean, it wasn't surprising because it wasn't contradicting previous research, but it was sobering to see it myself. And that was that white people were more likely to get mental health services than people of color. And it was only adolescents I was looking at. And I did the statistics in such a way that I controlled for people having suicidal thoughts. So, it was as if everyone had the same level of severe problems, and still white people were more likely. And if I'm remembering correctly, and I may not be, but I think it was that Black people were half as likely, adolescents, and Latinx it was less than white people as well. So that just told me that need for help isn't necessarily the biggest predictor of getting help. And there were other things too. And I also did research in my doctoral program with a professor who was doing a study with Native Americans who lived on a reservation in the southwestern part of the United States. And then Native Americans, and these were all adolescents as well, who lived near the reservation in an urban area, but the urban area was near the reservation. She was happy to give me the data that pertained to suicide and suicidality, and I analyzed those. And in the key finding there was, and this isn't really surprising, but that the youth living on the reservation had much higher rates of suicidality and higher rates of risk factors like substance use. And then we did a study on their reasons for not seeking help. And the main finding from that study was a little different from the research of the day. It's not surprising today, but at the time, people were focusing on concrete barriers to getting help, like logistical things like not having insurance, not having bus transportation to get to an appointment. But in this study that I did with these Native American youth, the main reasons for not getting help were internal. Like one of them, and this was the title of the article, was something along the lines of, they'll say I'm crazy, and it had to do with fear of judgment and also a belief that they should be able to solve problems on their own and should be, quote, quote, strong enough to not need help from others.
I just was thinking, as you were talking about the research too, even after talking about your story, like stigma is real. And it made me think for a moment. I know that when I reached out for help when I was young, a kid, I mean, people react badly. They reacted badly to me when I said that I was suicidal. It was like, what's wrong with you? And not like, what's wrong with you in like a caring way necessarily, like, what the hell is wrong with you that you're even saying this?
Yeah.
Like making me feel worse. for having these thoughts. I mean, that's how I felt when I was young. Why are you being so mean about this?
I hear really painful things that kids are told. Things like, how could you think of doing that to me? How could you think of hurting me like this? Or, you have it so good. You're so spoiled. I had it so much harder and I never thought of killing myself, that kind of statement. And I know people are well-intentioned when they say things like that. They want their child to not have suicidal thoughts, but it can be wounding.
Definitely. Emma, I know that you had a serious thought about suicide recently. I woke up to a message from Emma about suicide, and I said, don't forget that we're about to record with Stacey, and we can talk about it then.
So I just wanted to add, though, first a little bit from my experience, and I never talked to anyone about my attempts or my suicidal thoughts when I was young. Really, like, I think the only person I told was my husband before I came on this podcast. And then I felt okay to talk about it. And part of it was because Chris had already shared a story on another podcast. It opened up that space for me to be able to talk about it. But I know that when I left my ex, and it was a pretty fucked up relationship, my dad's reaction was, why did you let him treat you that way? I never raised you to be so weak. And I'm like, A-class victim blaming, Dad, but like, what? How could I then tell him about all this other stuff if that was the reaction to the realities of the relationship, which were already sort of starting to come to the surface and be a bit public? So, I think societal stigma is one thing in that, they'll think I'm crazy, which is why I never went to therapy, because I'm like, I had this horrible idea that I was going to be locked away in a straitjacket and they were going to throw away the key. But it's also how the people closest to you are going to react to that stuff. And if you can't find support, it's devastating and just encourages you to keep it a secret. But on the topic of keeping it a secret and how people can't know, I messaged Chris because I started watching Anthony Bourdain episodes, and I didn't binge watch a whole heap of it, but I watched enough episodes to have this sort of like, how could no one have seen the signs? Honestly, the way he talks about life, the way he talks about himself, and arguably it's when he's at his best, like he's on TV, he's able to share these thoughts with the world, and he's doing, what he loves as a career. Like, if that leaches into that space, surely people in his life could see him when he's at his worst. And how do they not know? But I had the thought that I shared with Chris is like, perhaps you have had to have been in that situation to understand the lengths that people go to cover this up, and how people are struggling to remain functional. And then it's almost like a last resort when the pain just becomes way too much. Because I think that's a bit of a misconception, is that people who are going through suicidal ideation are quitters. Often that's not the case. You struggle and you keep going forward. And where it's just when you can't see any hope on the horizon for yourself and you feel like you're a complete burden, that you hit that last resort. And I wonder what your thoughts are on, that looking at the stigma, looking at the secrecy around it. How are people even supposed to tell that someone needs help when they're resisting help? When they're trying to hide, when they're trying to struggle on.
It's hard. I mean, when I was young, when I was at that summer camp and I had that night where I was like, okay, that's what I'm going to do tonight, I did tell somebody. I told the director of the camp, and she was very caring. I mean, she hugged me and she said, this will pass. You'll feel better. Don't do anything stupid. I mean, that's what she said. And the next morning when I woke up, she was gone. And I know there was no connection between my telling her I had suicidal thoughts and her being gone, but she had been fired in between my telling her that I had suicidal thoughts and my, going to the mess hall the next day where we went to eat. And then when I came home from camp, I did tell somebody, I told an adult that I knew, and nothing happened. And it was never brought up again. And so after that, I didn't tell anybody pretty much until I was 25 and went to therapy for the first time. And like you, Emma, I was terrified of being, immediately sent to a hospital, especially because a lot of abuses were happening at that time where people were being hospitalized for really long times and then turning around and suing and saying, you didn't need to hospitalize me for 364 days. And by the way, the only reason you discharged me is my insurance benefits ended. But secrecy was a big part of my journey too. Well, Anthony Bourdain, after he died, somebody in the suicide research field, they went through a lot of different interviews, not all, but just, a substantial amount of interviews and episodes. And they found more than 30 instances, if I'm remembering that number correctly, where he said he would kill himself. And he usually said it as a joke. Like he'd say, if I'm at the airport and I have a bad cheeseburger, I feel so bad I want to kill myself. It was clearly top of mind because again and again, he would make jokes about killing himself. And sometimes those jokes were very specific. And he would talk about method. And sometimes he would talk about place. And when he did kill himself, he used the method and did it in the place that he had said in one of the times that he spoke flippantly about suicide. And I have an example in, I guess this is something that wasn't said in the introduction, but I have 2 books, one for professionals and one for like family and friends of people who have suicidal thoughts. And both of them are about helping someone who has suicidal thoughts. But the one for loved ones really focuses on how the instinctive responses they might want to have if someone discloses suicidal thoughts could shut the conversation down, could scare the person from saying more. And in that book, the second book, I have an anecdote about an ER physician who wrote an essay about her experiences with suicidality. And she was resolved to kill herself, or else she was very seriously considering killing herself. And somebody one day in the ER said, "How are you doing?" And she said, "Nothing that 100 units of insulin couldn't fix." And they laughed. And she laughed. So people hide really well. I just coincidentally immediately before coming on to this podcast, was editing something I've written about when I made a joke when I was 25 and somebody called me out on it. And I said to him very dryly, he said something along the lines of, "You joke about suicide a lot." And I was like, "Yeah." And he said, "You know what they say about people who joke about suicide a lot? They're thinking of suicide." And with just same tone of voice, same expression, I just said, "You caught me. I'm thinking of suicide." And then everyone around me laughed. They thought I was joking.
Wow.
And I was. I wasn't sincerely confiding in him. I was, being dry.
Wow, that's so interesting. I never thought about this joking aspect before. So it's interesting to me that that's come up because I used to joke about it all the time when I was suicidal because, yeah, it was totally, it was like the most, like you said, like top of mind for me. And I was like a class clown kind of person when I was younger. So,
But I think it's not just because it's top of mind. Yeah, it's a bit of top of mind, but it's also about the fact that there's a level of flippancy you get about it because it seems like a viable option to you. Whereas with other people, they wouldn't even dream of joking about something so horrendous and outside of their realm of comprehension. You've almost come to terms with it and made friends with the concept in your own head. So, yeah, you can laugh about it.
Well, and that's a great point. And maybe even the joking is a way to come to terms with it. Because there's a theory of suicide by Thomas Joyner called the interpersonal psychological theory of suicide. And he says there are three conditions that have to be met for someone to kill themselves. One is that they're hurting or, coming up short in some way, maybe not pain, but maybe existential ennui, something is happening that they're experiencing. And as a result of that, they perceive themselves as a burden to others. They experience a thwarted sense of belongingness. And that doesn't have to mean they don't have social support. They may have all the social support in the world, but they're not feeling it. Like I've had clients say to me that they feel like they're behind the glass windshield and nobody can touch them and they're watching everything. But the third thing he says that has to happen is that they acquire the capacity or the capability to end their life, because we have a very strongly biologically wired survival instinct. And it's not natural to end your life. Like my body kept breathing. And you hear these stories like that man who cut off his arm. He was trapped by a boulder for 3 days and then he cut it off his arm so he could survive. I mean, people will go to incredible lengths to survive. So to be able to overcome that instinct requires some kind of desensitization to suicide, whether to suicide or to pain or to risk. And that's what his research on others using that theory has found, is that people exposed to death or danger in their jobs have higher rates of suicide. And the thinking is that they've become desensitized. So I hadn't thought before of joke and humor as a way of desensitizing oneself, but I bet that there is a mechanism in there for that.
Well, Dąbrowski, his dissertation in 1929, his medical thesis, was on the psychological conditions of suicide, but it's in French, and so I've never properly read it. I've translated it, using AI to translate. It's not quite the same, but it's fascinating to me that this was like the early focus of his work, and he lost a dear friend to suicide, and so, it all makes sense, but I guess the other big thing that's been on my mind is, you mentioned your books. And so I've read Helping the Suicidal Person. I haven't read your other book yet, but I will. I've recommended it to a lot of people already because I get pretty regular messages from people who either know me or don't really know me, wondering what they should do about their loved one, friend, partner, whatever, who's suicidal. And so one of the things I wonder if you could do for us is just to kind of say, like in a nutshell, even, what do you do when somebody close to you is suicidal? How do you handle that in a way that doesn't cause more harm? And I say that because I feel like calling the police or doing some kind of intervention like that is not the way to go, just from my own experiences with that. And so I wonder, like, what do you tell people? I just do the best I can when people reach out with that question.
Yeah, that's a big part of the second book, but the title is Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts, What Family, Friends, and Partners Can Say and Do. And there are things about like things that are helpful to say, things that might not be helpful to say. But the overriding theme, I would say, is the need to really listen. And I use the phrase brave listening or listen bravely. And I say in the book that brave listening is asking questions whose answers you fear and listening to what's hard to hear without immediately trying to talk the person out of what they're saying, come up with a solution, tell them they're wrong, barraging them with questions, because that's what a lot of people think they need to do. Is if someone says, I'm having suicidal thoughts, then the next question is, do you have a plan? Do you have the means? But that's not what people need. Nobody has the thought of, if only someone would ask me a ton of yes, no questions, then I'd feel better, So I talk about just really that, like, listening is more important. How you listen is more important than what you say. And that it's hard to listen. It's hard to really sit with someone. And even me, I been preaching this for years, and I'm a therapist. And even I sometimes, when I'm sitting with someone who's in an abject state of suicidal thinking, I have things come to mind where I want to try to persuade them that, not to give up hope, or they'll see it differently, and I have to like stop myself and really just try to sit with them and hear what they're saying and encourage them to say more, so that they are able to talk about it. Well, an example that I give in presentations a lot is that the first suicide hotline I volunteered at was before the University of Texas. It was a volunteer hotline. And somebody called and they said something along the lines of, I'm a bad person and I don't deserve to live, something like that. And the way I say this in presentations sometimes is that the person said, I'm a bad person, I don't deserve to live. And this was a suicide hotline. And that the counselor said, you're not a bad person. You absolutely deserve to live. And that the person said, oh my God, I didn't think of that. Thank you. I feel much better now. No, I'm kidding though. That's not at all what happened, and that's a fantasy that we could just that magically help someone feel better by telling them that they're wrong. And so I talk in presentations and with my students about what can you say when someone says something like that? I'm a terrible person. I don't deserve to live. First, I talk about what you're tempted to say. And the temptation is, you're not a bad person. Everybody deserves to live. You haven't done anything that awful. Some people will say they're tempted to say, why do you say that? But often it's like, why would you say that? Not, like you said before, Chris, about that there are questions you can ask where tone is everything, And so then we talk about like, what could you say to someone who says that? And often it's saying very little at all, and these are just some possibilities among many, many. So many possibilities. So this isn't like one right way, but some possibilities could be to say, God, you're feeling really bad about yourself right now. What's going on? Or you really feel like you're a bad person. Somebody said to me after a presentation that they always just repeat the last few words someone said, which on the one hand can be very inviting, but on the other hand, if you do it too much, can become mechanical. Or even just hugging the person, or saying, I'm here. Do you want to say more? I'm sorry you're hurting like that. And showing a desire to hear more and to, if not understand, to try to understand. But it's very hard. I mean, I know many people who are therapists. I've encountered myself many therapists as a client who can't sit that way with somebody in their suffering or in their despair.
And that makes total sense in light of what you said about the first 2 points before of you've got people around you, but you feel isolated from them, probably because there's a lack of understanding, but also you feel like you're a burden on them, which I totally resonate with. But in order to not feel like a burden and to feel connecting, someone showing the want and the desire to understand you and connect with you and not just lecture you and like push you back into the mold by, oh, you're okay, you're not a bad person, blah, 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 rote societal cliches. That's how you do it. Like by listening and being curious and understanding and, giving them a hug. It's like, I want to be here and connect to you in the place where you are because you are valid and you are worthy and you're worth understanding and you're worth connecting with. And I guess that's, rather than continually throwing out the invite of, oh, go out to your social networks and connect with them and put more emotional labor on the person who's in pain for them to make the effort to try and make the connection, to have someone show that understanding to them and the want to be with them and the want to sit in that space with them, because as far as they're concerned, they are that dark, horrible shit place. They are that bad person. Someone's got to be willing to wade into that muck and sit in it with them in order to show them that it's ironically not so bad. Like shining a light and going, oh, life is all sparkly and that. It's like, they don't fucking feel that way. Like, and you're not going to convince them otherwise. But what you can convince them of, that is, they are actually worth you making the effort to climb down into the hole with them and sit with them in the mud.
That's exactly right. I love how you said that, because the cover of my first book, I realize people listening can't see this, but y'all can see it. And the publisher let me pick out the photo, and the photo is of a winding staircase that goes down and down. There's a name for this kind of shape, the way it occurs in nature. I can't remember, but Chris, you probably know it because you have all these interesting facts in your head. But what I like about it is that in the middle of this hole, it's pitch dark. See how it's black. And people tend to stand in the light part of the stairs, at the top of the stairs. And this is, metaphorically, they stand there and they say, come on out. It's light. Come on. It's not as bad as you think. But what we need to do is go down the stairs. And as you said, get in the hole with the person. We need to go downstairs and get into the darkness with them. And it's not magical. I've seen the phrase prevent suicide with your ears, and I feel like that's a false promise. It's not that suicide or suicidality is so simple that it can be always resolved with one conversation, but sometimes it can, not entirely, but that one conversation can give the person hope that they can talk about what they're experiencing, or that they're not alone, or that they're not going to be rejected. And that's one of my soapboxes. I had a friend when I did start telling people. So I was a journalist before I was a social worker. So in my previous life, I had an episode of suicidality with a suicide attempt before I got into social work. And in that place of my life, I didn't keep it secret. I was open. The secrecy came when I got into the mental health field. But I'm just saying this so you'll understand when I say that I had a friend when I first started being open about suicidal thoughts when I was 25, and she got mad at me. And she was like, Stacey, don't talk to me about this. It's upsetting. And I can't hear it. Call your therapist. And she was mad. Whew. That's not a way I would recommend.
It's the same methodology as the come up the staircase to the light part. It's like, I'm only going to love you when you're nice and shiny and sparkly. I'll only love you when you come back into the light. For someone who doesn't think, if that was fucking possible, you'd be doing it, right? Coming back into the light. It's like, right. You want to hear someone say, I can love you in the dark.
I can be with you. And I heard a podcast once, I think it was Glennon Doyle, but I might be wrong. But the gist of it was that there was like a yoga class, and there was somebody who had a physical disability, and they kept falling, and people would pull them back up, and they kept falling. And then one time they fell, and someone sat down with them and talked to them. And they were so glad about that. I mean, it's a little, pat of a metaphor, but when I heard it, it was really powerful. And something I want to say related to that is often, it's very hard for people to ask someone if they have suicidal thoughts. A lot of people are scared. They're scared that they'll give the person the idea, or they're scared that they'll make the person mad, or maybe some are scared of emotional contagion. What if the answer is yes, then I'm going to get really upset. So first of all, it's hard to ask. And I really, that's one of my soapboxes, is to try to ask, because we know from research that half of people who die by suicide don't tell anybody beforehand. And even among therapists recently, adolescents and young adults in Australia. Are you in Australia, Emma?
Sure am.
Okay. So this study was in Australia, and it was of adolescents and young adults who were in therapy and had been suicidal. They were asked, did you tell your therapist? And 40% did not. asking is important, but also then when they answer, how you respond is important, because often a person will say no when the answer is yes, because they're scared. And then often what happens is that the person who asks, they say, are you having thoughts of suicide? And the other person's like, no. And then the first person says, oh, thank God. That's so good. I was worried you might be. Well, what message does the person get who really is having suicidal thoughts? They're like, oh God, it's a good thing I didn't tell them. That would have been bad. And so I try to talk to people about, like my students and other people, about responding with, if you really have to say that's good, to say that's good for us to know. And then to follow up, like, if in the future you were having suicidal thoughts, do you think you would tell me? And a lot of people say no, or you could follow up with, depending on the context and situation, with how depressed you feel, and with, I'm just making up a scenario, with how depressed you feel and with suicidal thoughts being a symptom of depression, what do you think stops you from thinking of suicide? That can be another way to respond.
Well, thank you so much for that. I know that this will be helpful. I want to send this episode to, I can think of one person.
We're going to leave the conversation here for now, but we will resume it again in the next episode. I'd like to thank our guest Stacey for joining us, thank Chris, and thank you too, listeners, for being with us. We appreciate you. Continue your path to authenticity through the links in the show notes. Subscribe to our Substack newsletter for stacks of cool things delivered straight to your inbox. Explore the Dąbrowski Centre, email us, or join us on social media. And don't forget to show your love by liking, subscribing, grabbing some positive Disintegration merch, or leaving us a rating or review on your podcast platform.